What would you risk for a family that isn't yours by blood? The question hung in the autumn air of Santa Fe like smoke from a distant fire, unspoken but present, waiting for an answer that would change 7 lives forever. Inside the stone walls of the Catholic Mission Infirmary, Ayanna's hands moved with practiced precision across the small wound on the Apache child's arm. The boy, no more than 6, watched her with dark eyes that had seen too much. 2. She hummed softly as she worked an old healing song her grandmother had taught her before the world broke apart that morning in 1880 when the soldiers came and the screaming started, and everyone she loved fell silent forever. Sister Maria appeared in the doorway, her wimples stark white against the adobe shadows. She carried a letter, and something in the way she held it, careful as broken glass, made Ayanna's hands still. "Child dying in Ruidoso," Sister Maria said quietly. "Father desperate." The words were simple. The weight behind them was not. Ayanna finished tying off the bandage, touched the boy's cheek gently, and took the letter. The paper was rough, the handwriting angular, and hurried, written by a man who worked with his hands and wasn't accustomed to asking for help. "No prejudice here," the letter read. "Just need capable hands. Boy is 4. Fever won't break. 3 days now. Will pay what I can. Come soon if you're coming. James Hartwell, Ruidoso, Lincoln County." In the distance, a rifle shot cracked across the evening, then another. The Apache families camped near the mission scattered like birds familiar with the sound of white fear turning into white violence. Sister Maria's face tightened. The settlement south had another raid. Real or imagined, I don't know anymore, but the soldiers are restless. Ayanna looked at the letter again. Ruidoso was 2 days north, near the mountains where her people had once hunted, before the world decided they no longer had the right to exist in the places their ancestors were buried. "You could die on that road," Sister Maria said, not unkindly, just honest. "Or arrive and find he's changed his mind about Apache hands touching his white child." Ayanna folded the letter carefully. She thought of her grandmother's voice, strong and certain, even as age had bent her spine. "Healing is healing, child, no matter whose blood spills. The wound doesn't ask the color of the hands that bind it." "Then I'll die trying," Ayanna said, "or I'll save a child and prove that capable hands don't need to be white." Sister Maria's eyes were sad but unsurprised. She had found Ayanna 6 years ago in a canyon half dead from thirst and grief, the only survivor of a massacre the newspapers called a necessary military action. She knew what living with ghosts did to a person. Sometimes you had to create new reasons to wake up, or the old reasons would bury you. "Go with God," Sister Maria said, making the sign of the cross. Ayanna didn't believe in the mission's God, not really, but she believed in the kindness of the woman who had saved her when the world said Apache lives were worth less than cattle. She bowed her head and accepted the blessing. She left before dawn when the sky was still purple and the stars were fading like old promises. The road north was dust and stone and endless sky, the kind of landscape that made a person feel both infinite and impossibly small. She rode a borrowed mare, carried her grandmother's medicine bundle, and tried not to think about what waited at the end of the journey. She didn't know this choice would give her 6 children one man's heart and a battle that would test whether love could truly conquer fear. But she would learn. The Hartwell Ranch appeared at sunset on the second day, a sprawl of weathered wood and split-rail fences against the backdrop of mountains that looked like they were painted with fire. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and desperate, the kind of smoke that comes from a house where people have forgotten to tend the fire because they're tending something more urgent. Ayanna saw the man before he saw her. He stood on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of someone who had stopped sleeping and started bargaining with God. When he finally noticed her approach, something flickered across his face. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of what hope used to feel like. "Miss," he called out, his voice rough from disuse or shouting or both. "You the healer from Santa Fe?" "I am," Ayanna said, dismounting. Up close, she could see the details that distance had hidden. James Hartwell was maybe 36, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were blue like deep water currently bloodshot from exhaustion. His shirt was stained with something that might have been sweat or tears or both, and his hands shook slightly as he wiped them on his pants. "He's burning up," James said, without preamble, without introduction, without the careful dance of politeness that usually preceded white people asking Apache women for help. 3 days now. Sometimes he knows me, sometimes he doesn't. I've tried everything. Cold water, prayer, whiskey on his gums. Nothing works. "Show me," Ayanna said. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. James turned and led her into the house at a pace just short of running through a front room cluttered with children's toys and unwashed dishes down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom where the air was thick and hot and smelled like sickness. The boy lay in a bed too big for him, his small body lost in blankets that had been kicked aside in fevered restlessness. His face was flushed dark red, his breathing rapid and shallow, and even from the doorway, Ayanna could see the slight tremor of seizure beginning to take hold. She crossed the room in 3 strides, her medicine bag already open. Her hands went to the boy's forehead first, confirming what her eyes had already told her. The fever was dangerously high, high enough to cook the brain if it wasn't brought down soon. Behind her, she heard other children gathering in the doorway. 5 of them, ranging from maybe 13 down to 6, all watching with wide eyes that held suspicion and fear and desperate hope tangled together like rope. At the front of the group stood a girl on the edge of womanhood, thin and fierce with dark braids and her father's serious eyes. When she spoke, her voice was hard with barely contained anger. "Mama said Indian medicine killed her cousin," the girl said. Ayanna didn't look up. Her hands were already moving, pulling out willow bark yarrow, a small leather pouch of powder her grandmother had called fever breaker. She mixed them with water from the basin by the bed, her movements quick but precise muscle memory from 6 years of healing in the mission and 26 years before that learning at her grandmother's side. "Then watch," Ayanna said calmly. "If he dies, you can hate me forever. If he lives, perhaps you'll learn that medicine doesn't care about the color of the hands that administer it." She tilted the boy's head back, gently, coaxed the mixture past his lips, massaged his throat to encourage swallowing. He coughed, sputtered, but enough went down. Then she soaked cloths in cool water, placed them on his forehead, his neck, his wrists where the blood ran close to the surface. And then she sang. It was an old song, older than the mission, older than the soldiers, older than the idea that some people had the right to decide other people's worth. Her grandmother had sung it over countless fevered children in the days when the Apache still lived free in these mountains. The words were in a language most white people had never heard, and many wanted to erase from existence. James Hartwell stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching. The 5 children in the doorway stood equally still, caught between inherited prejudice and the undeniable fact that this Apache woman with scarred hands and a voice like smoke was fighting for their brother's life with an intensity that looked like love. 10 minutes passed, the longest 10 minutes of several lives. And then the boy's breathing began to slow. The flush in his cheeks faded from angry red to something closer to pink. The tremoring stopped. His eyes, which had been moving frantically beneath closed lids, went still. Ayanna checked his temperature again. Still hot, but no longer dangerous, no longer cooking. The fever had broken its worst hold. She sat back on her heels, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. James Hartwell collapsed into the chair beside the bed, his face in his hands. For a moment Ayanna thought he might be crying. Then she heard the words muffled but clear. "Thank God, thank God, thank you." The boy Joey slept peacefully now, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of healing rather than crisis. Ayanna wiped her hands on her skirt and turned to face the 5 children still clustered in the doorway. They stared at her. She stared back. The oldest girl's face was a complicated landscape of emotions. The anger was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Confusion, maybe, or the first crack in a wall built from grief and loyalty to a mother who wasn't here anymore. "You've been scared," Ayanna said quietly to all of them. "Fear makes you tired." She moved past them into the kitchen, found a kettle, found water, found herbs in her bag. Within minutes, the smell of tea filled the house, something soothing with chamomile and mint that had nothing to do with Apache tradition and everything to do with simple human kindness. She poured 6 cups, brought them to the table. The children came slowly, warily, like deer approaching a salt lick. But they came. The youngest boy, maybe 7, with dirt on his face, and questions in his eyes, spoke first. "Are you a witch?" he asked. Ayanna smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled since leaving Santa Fe. "If I were," she said, "I'd make you eat your vegetables without complaining." A small laugh from one of the middle children. A girl, maybe 8, with blonde hair in tangles and a gap-toothed grin that appeared and disappeared like sunlight through clouds. Even the oldest girl, the fierce one, almost smiled. Almost. They drank their tea in silence, the comfortable kind that comes after crisis when words feel both insufficient and unnecessary. James emerged from the bedroom, his eyes red but clear. He looked at his children gathered around the table with this Apache stranger, and something in his chest loosened a fraction. Not all the way. He'd carried too much weight for too long for it to release completely. but enough to breathe a little deeper. "I can't pay much," he said to Ayanna, honest and direct. "Ranch barely breaks even these days, but the letter said honest work for honest pay, and I'm a man of my word." "Letter said honest work," Ayanna replied. "I'm here for the work, not the gold." James extended his hand across the table. It was rough with calluses scarred from years of ranching, but the gesture was genuine. "Partners, then," he said. "You save lives, I save cattle." Ayanna took his hand. His grip was firm, respectful, the handshake of equals rather than employer and hired help. "Deal," she said. Then with the smallest hint of humor, "But I might save your cattle too." It was the right thing to say. The tension in the room eased another fraction. The children's shoulders dropped. James almost laughed, a sound that clearly hadn't been heard in this house for far too long. And then, in the distance, a gunshot. Then another. James's face went hard. The children froze. Ayanna set down her teacup carefully. She had heard those sounds before, the sound of white men with weapons and purpose, usually purpose, that involved making Apache people disappear. "Clayton's men," James said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, "probably chasing refugees from the reservation again." He looked at Ayanna, and in that look was an apology and a warning and a question all tangled together. "There's trouble in these parts," he said. "Some folks don't take kindly to Apache presence, even healers, even good people like you. If you want to leave come morning, I'll understand." Ayanna thought about Sister Maria's warning. You could die on that road. She thought about the 6 children watching her, especially the small boy sleeping in the next room who had called out to her in his fever dreams, his voice desperate for a mother who was gone. She thought about her grandmother's hands, strong and sure, binding wounds without asking whose blood it was. "I said honest work," Ayanna replied. "I keep my word." The next morning arrived with golden light and the smell of coffee that Ayanna had made from James's dwindling supply. Joey woke with clear eyes and asked for breakfast, the first solid food he'd wanted in 4 days. The other children gathered around him like he'd returned from the dead, which in a way he had. Ayanna checked each of them while they ate. The middle girl, Maggie, had an ear infection that explained why she'd been so quiet. The boy who'd asked about witches, Henry, had a cut on his hand that was starting to show signs of infection. She treated both with supplies from her medicine bag, her movements quick and efficient, already falling into the rhythm of caretaker. The oldest girl, Abigail, watched everything with narrow eyes, not hostile exactly, but not trusting either. Protective, the way a person becomes when they've had to be the mother too young and aren't ready to give up the role, even when help arrives. "Your mother must have been very strong," Ayanna said quietly to Abigail as she cleaned Henry's hand, "to raise 6 children and run a house." It was a gamble, speaking of the dead woman, but sometimes the only way through grief was straight into it. Abigail's jaw tightened. For a moment, Ayanna thought the girl might walk away. Instead, she spoke, her voice low and fierce. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. She could birth a calf and bake bread and shoot a rifle all in the same day. She never complained, never quit, not until the sickness took her." "Then you learned from the best," Ayanna said. "And when you're ready to rest a little, to be 13 instead of a second mother, I'll be here to help carry the weight." Abigail stared at her, really stared, like she was trying to see past skin and bone to whatever truth lived underneath. "We'll see," Abigail finally said. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was the beginning of something. A door not opened yet, but unlocked. After breakfast, James showed Ayanna the ranch, the barn that needed mending, the chicken coop, the garden plot that had gone to weeds since Rebecca died. As they walked, he talked not about work, but about his children. How Ben was good with numbers. How Maggie had stopped speaking much after her mother passed. How Lily was afraid of everything but pretended not to be. How Henry collected rocks. How Joey had started calling every woman he saw Mama in the desperate hope that one of them would stay. And Abigail, always Abigail, 13 going on 40, carrying the weight of motherless siblings on shoulders too young and too thin. "She's been amazing," James said, "but she shouldn't have to be. She should be learning to dance and giggling about boys and fighting with her siblings over stupid things. Instead, she's raising them." "Then let her be 13 again," Ayanna said. "That's why I'm here." They stood at the edge of the property, looking out over grassland that rolled toward mountains still dusted with snow at the peaks. It was beautiful country, the kind of landscape Ayanna's people had loved and lost. Standing here felt like visiting a grave and a promise at the same time. "I could use an herb garden," Ayanna said, changing the subject before the weight of it crushed her. "Willow, sage, yarrow. They grow well here. Would save money on medicine." James nodded slowly. "Show me what you need. I'll build the beds." "I can help," came a voice from behind them. They turned. Ben stood there, the 10-year-old with freckles and hope in his eyes. "If that's all right," Ben added quickly. "I'm good at building things." Ayanna smiled. "Then we're partners too." They spent the afternoon planning the garden, drawing layouts in the dirt with sticks, Ben asking questions about plants and uses and Apache names for things he'd only known by English words. Lily and Henry wandered over eventually, curious, and before long, 4 people were working together in the sun, planning something that would grow. Maggie watched from the porch, silent but attentive. And then so quietly that Ayanna almost missed it, the girl came down the steps and handed Ayanna a wild flower. No words, just the flower. Ayanna tucked it into her hair, gentle as prayer. "Thank you, little one," she said. Maggie smiled, small, fleeting, but real. Abigail saw it from the kitchen window. Her face was complicated emotions moving across it like weather, but she didn't look away. The piece lasted exactly 3 hours. Wade Clayton arrived at sunset with 3 deputies, their horses kicking up dust that turned gold in the failing light. He was a man in his 40s with a badge that didn't quite fit right and eyes that calculated profit before justice. "Heard you got an Apache woman here, Hartwell," Wade said without dismounting. James stepped onto the porch, his children clustering behind him. Ayanna stood to the side, visible but not cowering. She'd learned long ago that showing fear to men like this was the same as bleeding in front of wolves. "I got a healer," James said, his voice level. "What's your business, Wade?" "My business is keeping the peace." Wade's eyes moved to Ayanna, assessed her like property. "My brother Marcus says you're late on that land payment. 3 months late." "I'll have it," James said. "When?" "Soon." "How soon?" Wade leaned forward in his saddle. "Because Marcus is getting impatient. And now I hear you're harboring an Apache. Some folks might see that as poor judgment, might make them wonder if you're fit to keep this land at all." The threat was clear. The connection between Marcus Clayton wanting the land and Wade Clayton using his badge to get it was equally clear. This was corruption wearing the costume of law, and everyone present knew it. "She's legal," James said. "She has papers from the Santa Fe mission." "Papers don't mean much when folks are scared," Wade replied. "Town council meets next week. There's been talk, Apache presence making people nervous, especially after the raid south." "There were no raids," Ayanna said quietly. "Just rumors and fear." Wade's attention snapped to her. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling fear a liar," Ayanna said. "It tells you monsters are coming when really it's just shadows." For a moment Wade looked genuinely surprised that she'd spoken. Then his face hardened. "Careful, woman. This is white man's territory. You're here on sufferance." "This is everyone's territory," Ayanna said. "Your people stole it from mine. That doesn't make it more yours, just makes you thieves with paperwork." James made a small sound that might have been fear or might have been suppressed laughter. The children's eyes went wide. Wade's hand moved toward his gun. "She stays," James said loudly, stepping forward. "This is my land, my decision. If you've got legal concerns, bring them to court. Otherwise, get off my property." Wade stared at him for a long moment. The air felt tight, like the space between lightning and thunder. Finally, Wade smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "For now," he said. "But Marcus doesn't forget debts, Hartwell. And he doesn't like complications. You just made yourself very complicated." He wheeled his horse and rode off, his deputies following. The dust settled slowly. James let out a breath. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline finally catching up to decision. "You didn't have to do that," Ayanna said. "Yeah," James said. "I did?" Behind them, Joey had emerged from the house, still weak but mobile. He walked to Ayanna, looked up at her with the uncomplicated trust that only 4-year-olds possess. "Mama Yaya," he said, the name tumbling out sweet and simple. "You staying?" Ayanna crouched down to his level. "If your father will have me?" "I will," Joey said seriously. "Then yes," Ayanna said. "I'm staying." Joey hugged her fierce and sudden. Over his small shoulder, Ayanna saw Abigail in the doorway. The girl's face was unreadable, but tears tracked down her cheeks. In the distance on the ridge above the ranch, a figure sat on horseback watching. Marcus Clayton, with a rifle across his saddle, surveying his next acquisition like a king surveying a conquered province. He didn't know yet that he was about to lose, but he would learn. They all would. The first week passed in the careful dance of strangers learning to become something more. Ayanna rose before dawn to tend Joey's lingering weakness, made breakfast for 7 people who weren't her family, but might become it, and spent her days establishing the rhythms that turn a house into a home. She planted the herb garden with Ben's eager help, taught Lily the names of healing plants in both Apache and English, and watched Abigail watch her with eyes that were slowly, painfully beginning to soften. But peace in Lincoln County was a fragile thing built on sand, and liable to wash away the moment someone decided profit mattered more than decency. The trouble started on a Thursday, 8 days after Ayanna's arrival, when James needed supplies from town and made the mistake of taking everyone with him. Ruidoso was small, barely more than a crossroads with pretensions, but it had a general store and a post office, and enough people to form opinions about things that weren't their business. The Hartwell wagon pulled up outside McAllister's general store just as the morning heat was beginning to settle like a weight across the dusty street. Sarah McAllister stood in her doorway, a woman in her 40s with iron-gray hair and a spine that didn't bend for anyone. She saw Ayanna climbing down from the wagon, and something passed across her face. Not quite approval, not quite suspicion, calculation maybe, the look of someone deciding whether to be brave or careful. "Miss Ayanna," Sarah said, testing out the name. "Heard you saved young Joey. That's good work." "Just medicine," Ayanna replied. "Medicine's never just medicine when it works," Sarah said. "Come on in, mind the step." The children scattered into the store with the enthusiasm of people who'd been cooped up too long, fingers reaching for penny candy and ribbons and all the small luxuries that ranch life couldn't provide. James followed them, keeping one eye on the running total and the other on his pocketbook. Ayanna stayed near the door, aware of the stares from the handful of other customers. An older woman clutched her purse tighter. A man in dusty coveralls moved to put more distance between himself and the Apache woman, like fear might be contagious. But it was outside in the street where the real trouble was brewing. Ben had wandered toward the hitching post, where 3 boys roughly his age were lounging in the shade. Ayanna saw it happening through the window and felt her stomach tighten. She knew that posture the way predators circle before they strike. "That your daddy's squaw?" one of the boys said loud enough to carry. Ben's face flushed red. "She's not. She's a healer, and don't use that word." "Why not?" The biggest boy probably 12 stepped closer. "That's what she is, ain't she, Injun woman warming your daddy's bed?" "Shut your mouth," Ben said, his fists clenching. "Bet she scalps people at night," another boy chimed in. "Bet she's just waiting to murder you all." Ayanna was already moving toward the door, but she wasn't fast enough. Ben swung. His fist connected with the bigger boy's jaw with a crack that sounded like a branch breaking. The boy staggered back, surprised, then lunged forward with the fury of someone who'd been embarrassed in front of his friends. The fight spilled into the street, a tangle of fists and dust and shouting. The other 2 boys joined in 3 against 1, and Ben was brave, but he was outnumbered and outweighed. Ayanna reached them in seconds. She moved the way her uncle had taught her long ago, the defensive techniques Apache warriors used when combat was necessary, but killing wasn't the goal. She caught one boy's wrist as he swung at Ben's head, twisted just enough to make him yelp and pull back. Stepped between another boy and Ben with the kind of presence that made violence pause to reconsider. "Enough," she said, not shouting, not threatening, just absolute certainty that this ended now. The boys backed off, breathing hard, reassessing. Ben's nose was bleeding, his lips split, but his eyes were fierce with the kind of pride that comes from standing up even when standing up hurts. And then Bart Simmons appeared. He was Marcus Clayton's foreman, a man built like a bull, and just as subtle with hands scarred from years of rough work and a mean streak that made even other mean men nervous. He took in the scene with piggy eyes and smiled the way a cat smiles at a cornered mouse. "Well now," Bart said, "Indian woman teaching white boys to brawl. That's interesting." "I'm teaching them to stop," Ayanna said calmly. "There's a difference." "Don't look like stopping to me." Bart moved closer, using his size like a weapon. "Looks like you're causing trouble. Mr. Clayton warned about this, said letting your kind settle leads to problems." James emerged from the store, saw the situation, and crossed the street fast. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Bart Simmons, you got eyes in your head or just rocks?" Sarah McAllister stood in her doorway, hands on her hips, every inch of her, radiating the kind of authority that came from 40 years of running a business and tolerating exactly 0 foolishness. "She broke up the fight, not started it," Sarah continued. "Your boys were 3-on-1 beating a 10-year-old. Where I come from, that's called cowardice, not entertainment." Bart's face darkened. "You defending an Apache over white children?" "I'm defending what's right over what's wrong," Sarah said, "and watching 3 boys gang up on one is wrong no matter what color skin is involved. Now, unless you've got business in my store, I suggest you move along before I decide your credit isn't good anymore." It was a direct hit. Bart bought supplies on Marcus Clayton's account, and if Sarah cut him off, he'd have to explain to his boss why. The calculation played across his face, anger warring with self-preservation. "This ain't over," Bart said, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Mr. Clayton's going to hear about this." I'm sure he will, Sarah said. Make sure you tell him the whole story, including the part where you threatened a woman half your size. Bart rode off his boys, trailing behind him like kicked dogs. The street went quiet. Ayanna knelt beside Ben, tilted his head back to examine the bloody nose. The boy was trembling, adrenaline and fear and something like gratitude all mixed together. You're brave, Ayanna said quietly, pulling a cloth from her bag to clean his face. But 3 against 1 isn't a fair fight. Next time find me first. They said terrible things about you, Ben whispered. Words are just wind, Ayanna replied. They blow past and leave nothing behind unless you let them plant roots. She looked up at James, saw the concern and frustration and helpless anger in his face. This was the problem with protecting someone. You couldn't be everywhere at once. You couldn't stop every cruel word or raised fist. Take him home, Sarah said gentler now. I'll send the supplies out tomorrow. No charge for the medical advice. James started to protest, but Sarah held up a hand. No charge, she repeated. Consider it payment for showing me there's still some backbone left in this town, even if I have to provide it myself. That evening, after supper had been eaten and wounds had been properly tended, and the younger children had been sent to bed still buzzing with the excitement of the day's drama, Ayanna found herself in the barn with Lily and Maggie. The 2 girls had followed her out, drawn by curiosity or loneliness, or the simple need to be near someone who felt safe. Will you teach us something? Lily asked, her voice small and hopeful. Something from before meant, before the missions, before the reservations, before the world had decided that Apache culture was something to be erased rather than celebrated. Ayanna felt the weight of that request, the responsibility of being maybe the only connection these children would ever have to a heritage that was being systematically destroyed. I can teach you to make dream catchers, Ayanna said. She pulled willow branches from the pile they'd collected for the garden, showed them how to bend the wood into circles, how to weave sinew in patterns that looked like spider webs. As they worked, she told them the story of Spider-Woman, the grandmother spirit who taught the people how to trap bad dreams and let good ones pass through. Lily's hands were clumsy at first, frustrated by the complexity. Maggie worked in silence, but her focus was absolute, each thread placed with deliberate care. My mama used to tell us stories, Lily said softly, before bed, about princesses and castles and magic. Those are good stories, Ayanna said. Do Apache have princesses? We have something better. We have grandmothers who could talk to eagles and warriors, who could run for 3 days without stopping, and healers who knew the name of every plant and what it could cure. Ayanna paused, her hand still on the dream catcher. Your mother's stories and my grandmother's stories aren't so different. They're both about people who were brave when being brave was hard. Maggie looked up, her eyes serious. Were you brave when the soldiers came? The question landed like a stone in still water. Ayanna's hands stopped moving. For a moment, she was back in that canyon 6 years younger and a lifetime more naive, listening to gunfire echo off stone walls and knowing that everyone she loved was dying, and there was nothing she could do but hide and survive and carry the guilt of survival forever. No, Ayanna said honestly. I hid. I was a coward. You lived, Maggie said. It was the most she'd spoken at once since Ayanna had arrived. That's not cowardly, that's smart. Sometimes living feels like the harder choice, Ayanna said, but someone has to survive to remember, someone has to keep the stories alive. They worked in comfortable silence after that 3 females of different ages and backgrounds, weaving thread into patterns that might catch bad dreams or might just be beautiful for their own sake. Either way, it felt like healing. From the barn door, Abigail watched her face shadowed and unreadable. The next morning, James asked Ayanna to ride with him to check the north pasture. It was practical work looking for broken fences and counting cattle, but it also felt like something else, an invitation to see more of the land that might become her home if she chose to stay. An opportunity to talk without 6 children listening to every word. They rode in silence for the first mile, the morning cool and clear, the mountains sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Ayanna watched the landscape with the attention her people had always given to land, reading it like a story written in stone and grass, and the patterns animals left behind. You're good at that, James said, noticing. Seeing things most people miss. My uncle taught me to track when I was small, Ayanna said. He said the land talks if you know how to listen. James was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had probably been building since the fight in town. Those scars on your hands, are they from the massacre? Ayanna looked down at her palms at the white lines that crossed them like a map of old pain. She'd stopped seeing them years ago the way you stop seeing familiar furniture, but they were there, permanent, as memory. "I tried to dig them out," she said simply. "After I found them, my mother, my father, my sisters, they were in a pile with 40 others. The soldiers had doused them with kerosene but hadn't lit the fire yet. I tried to pull them free. The kerosene burned through my gloves." James's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." "Everyone's sorry," Ayanna said. Not bitter, just tired. "Sorry doesn't bring them back." They rode in silence for another few minutes. Then James spoke again, his voice rough with confession. "Rebecca got sick winter of '84, he said. "Started as a cough, turned into something worse. Doc Pierce was in Santa Fe for a conference. We were alone and she was getting worse fast and I was terrified." He stopped, his horse stared at the horizon like the words might be written there. "Old Red Sky Walker came by. He's Apache, lives in the hills, trades sometimes with the ranchers who'll trade with him. He saw Rebecca through the window, knew she was sick. He offered to help. Said he had medicine that could break the fever, a sweat ceremony that could purge the sickness." Ayanna waited, knowing where this was going, feeling the shape of the guilt before he spoke it. "I said no," James continued. "I was afraid of what people would say if they knew I'd let an Apache treat my wife. Afraid the medicine wouldn't work and I'd blame myself. So I waited for Doc Pierce. Waited 3 more days while Rebecca got worse and worse. By the time Doc arrived, her lungs were too far gone. She died the next morning, calling for the children, asking me to take care of them." His voice broke on the last word. "I failed her," he said. "Fear made me a coward, and she paid the price." Ayanna guided her horse closer until they were side by side, close enough to touch, but not touching. "You loved her," Ayanna said gently. "Fear isn't failure. It's human. But it cost her life. And guilt won't bring her back," Ayanna said, echoing what she'd told herself 1,000 times. "But honoring her memory by living well, by taking care of the children she loved, by being brave enough to ask for help when you need it, that's love. That's how we make peace with the dead." James looked at her, then really looked, and in his eyes she saw recognition. 2 people carrying the weight of survival, learning to set it down, one small choice at a time. "The dead want us to live," Ayanna said, "not join them in grief." It became one of those moments that changes things, subtle as sunrise, but just as inevitable. When James reached over to help Ayanna down from her horse later, his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. When her fingers brushed his, neither of them pulled away immediately. Then they did pull away, awkward and uncertain, and laughed quietly at the awkwardness. "Partnership is complicated," Ayanna said. "Good complicated," James replied. They were still smiling when they heard the scream. Henry's voice, high and terrified, coming from the direction of the ranch house. James spurred his horse immediately, Ayanna right behind him, both of them racing across open ground with the sick certainty that something terrible had happened. They found Henry in the yard between the house and barn, his face white with shock, his right leg extended in front of him at an odd angle. Ben stood frozen a few feet away, and Joey was crying the way small children cry when they don't understand why the world suddenly turns scary. Coiled 3 feet from Henry Rattles, buzzing like 1,000 angry insects, was a diamondback rattlesnake the size of a man's arm. Ayanna was off her horse before James, moving fast, but not running, not making sudden movements that might provoke the snake to strike again. She could see the twin puncture marks on Henry's calf, could see the way the flesh was already starting to swell and discolor. "Henry," she said, her voice calm and absolutely certain. "Look at me. Not the snake. Me." The boy's eyes snapped to her face, wild with fear and pain. "You're going to be fine," Ayanna said. "I need you to be very still and very brave. Can you do that?" Henry nodded, tears streaming down his face. James had his rifle up, aimed at the snake. One shot, and the threat would be gone. But Ayanna shook her head minutely. The snake wasn't the danger anymore. The venom was. She knelt beside Henry, opened her medicine bag with hands that didn't shake despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. She'd done this before, treated snake bites in the mission, but always with the weight of knowing that speed and precision were the difference between life and death. "This is going to hurt," she said honestly, "but I need you to trust me." She made 2 small cuts over the bite marks, shallow and precise, and bent to suck out what venom she could reach. It was dangerous old medicine that doctors frowned upon, but it was also sometimes the difference between a child living and dying, and Ayanna had never been afraid of dangerous if it meant saving a life. She spat the venom into the dirt, wiped her mouth, then applied a poultice of yarrow and activated charcoal, bound it tight with a strip of cloth torn from her skirt. Finally, she elevated the leg and began to sing the same healing chant she'd sung for Joey, her voice steady and sure. Henry's breathing was fast and shallow, his whole body trembling. Ayanna kept one hand on his shoulder, an anchor point, while the other worked. "Breathe with me," she said. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're doing so well." Ben had run for Doc Pierce. The old physician arrived within 20 minutes, his bag in hand, his face prepared for the worst. What he found instead made him stop short. Ayanna had the wound cleaned and dressed the swelling already beginning to reduce the boy calm despite the pain. Her technique was flawless, her supplies organized, her manner professional. Dr. Pierce examined Henry with practiced hands, checked the wound, tested for necrosis that wasn't there. "This is perfect," Doc Pierce said more to himself than anyone else. "I couldn't have done better myself, and I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. He looked at Ayanna with new respect, the kind that comes when prejudice meets competence and has to choose which one matters more. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My grandmother," Ayanna said. "She was a shaman among our people. She taught me before the soldiers came." "She taught you well," Doc Pierce said. Then louder, for the benefit of the small crowd that had gathered, "This boy would have died without proper treatment. This woman saved his life." It was public acknowledgement from a white doctor, the kind of validation that carried weight in a town like Ruidoso. Several faces in the crowd shifted prejudice, cracking under the pressure of undeniable evidence. And then Abigail was there, pushing through the adults, her face white and drawn. She'd been in the house when it happened, had heard the screams but not known what they meant until now. She looked at Henry, at the bandage on his leg, at Ayanna, kneeling beside him, and something inside her broke open like a dam giving way. She crossed the yard in 3 strides and threw her arms around Ayanna, fierce and sudden, her whole body shaking. "Thank you," Abigail whispered into Ayanna's shoulder. "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank." Ayanna held her, this almost woman who'd been trying so hard to be strong, and felt the wall finally crumble, not all the way down, but enough for light to get through. "He's safe," Ayanna said softly. "You're all safe." From the ridge above the ranch, Marcus Clayton lowered his spyglass, his expression thoughtful. He'd watched the whole scene play out, had seen the doctor's public endorsement, had seen the town's opinion beginning to shift. That was a problem. But problems, Marcus knew, could be solved. You just had to find the right pressure point and push hard enough. He turned his horse toward town, already formulating a plan. The council meeting was in 2 days, time enough to remind people that miracles from Apache hands were still. Apache hands and Apache hands had spilled white blood before. Fear was a weapon. He just needed to sharpen it. The 3rd week arrived with autumn colors bleeding across the mountains and a quiet that felt like the pause between heartbeats. Deceptive, temporary, the kind of peace that exists only because the storm hasn't realized where you're hiding yet. James Hartwell stood in the doorway of his ranch house at dawn watching. In the herb garden that hadn't existed a month ago, Ayanna knelt between rows of plants with Maggie beside her, the girl's hands learning the difference between healing sage and prairie weed. Ben was demonstrating Apache tracking techniques to Henry and Lily, reading the dirt like it was a book written in a language only the earth knew how to speak. Joey rode on Abigail's shoulders, both of them laughing at something that probably wasn't even funny, but felt hilarious in the way things do when joy has been absent too long. The scene looked like a family, and that was the problem. James felt it settle in his chest, heavy and complicated. Guilt and hope wrestling for territory in the space where his heart used to know exactly what it wanted. He turned away from the window, walked to the small desk in the corner of the front room, and pulled out the Bible his mother had given him on his wedding day. The letter was pressed between Psalms and Proverbs, right where grief and comfort were supposed to meet. He hadn't looked at it in 2 years, hadn't been able to bear the weight of Rebecca's handwriting, those careful loops and curves formed by hands that would never hold a pen again. But he opened it now. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. The ink was still dark. The words were still impossibly clear. "My dearest James," it began, because Rebecca had always been formal even in intimacy, a product of her Boston upbringing and the belief that proper language honored important moments. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The consumption has won, or the fever, or whatever thing finally proved stronger than my stubborn refusal to leave you and our babies. I'm sorry. I fought as hard as I could. It wasn't enough." James's throat tightened. He forced himself to keep reading. "But James, listen to me. Don't mourn forever. Don't turn this house into a museum of what was. The children need laughter more than they need a monument to their mother. I want you to find someone, not to replace me because no one can do that any more than someone could replace you in my heart, but find someone who will love our children fiercely, someone who will stay when things are hard, someone who makes you remember that you're alive, not just surviving." I trust you, James. I trust your heart. When you find her, and I know you will because you're too good a man to let our babies grow up with only grief for a mother, don't let guilt stop you. Love her. Let her love you. Let her love them. Promise me you'll live, James. Not just exist. Live. Forever yours, Rebecca. The words blurred. James wiped his eyes, roughly angry at the tears, angry at the letter, angry at himself for needing permission from a dead woman to feel what he was already feeling. He loved Ayanna, not the same way he'd loved Rebecca. That had been young love built on shared dreams and the belief that hard work and good intentions could overcome anything. This was different, older, more careful, built on the understanding that the world breaks people, and sometimes the best you can do is gather up the pieces and try to make something new. Ayanna made him laugh, made the children laugh, made the house feel less like a place where they were all slowly drowning in the absence of someone they'd loved. But Marcus Clayton saw it too. That was the danger. As if summoned by thought, horses approached. James tucked the letter away quickly, stepped onto the porch. Tom Reeves dismounted, his weathered face grim. "Need to talk?" Tom said without preamble. They walked to the barn out of earshot of the children. Tom was a good neighbor, had been for 10 years the kind of man who helped with fence mending and never asked for payment except the promise you'd do the same when his turn came. "You're falling for her," Tom said bluntly. "I see it. Kids see it. Whole damn county sees it." James didn't deny it. "That a problem? Marcus Clayton sees it too," Tom said. "He'll use it." "Use what?" "The fact that I care about someone. The fact that you care about an Apache woman." Tom's voice was heavy with the weight of unfortunate truth. "James, I don't give a damn who you love. But that town council meeting Friday, it's not about permits or legal residency. It's about Marcus wanting your land and using fear to get it." James felt cold despite the morning sun. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying he's got the votes. Wade's already talked to half the council. They're scared, James. Scared of Apache uprising, scared of change, scared of anything that doesn't look like what their granddaddies told them the world should look like. They're going to expel her. Unless you marry her," Tom said. "Old territorial law, Lincoln County Code 47, Indian can't reside without white sponsor through marriage. Wade dug it up special. It's a trap, James. He figures either you lose Ayanna and your kids lose their healer, or you marry her and give the town ammunition to call you Indian lover and force a sale." James's hands clenched. "There's got to be another way." "Is there?" Tom met his eyes. "Because I've been thinking on it all week, and I can't see one. You marry her, some folks will hate you for it. You don't marry her, she has to leave, and your kids go back to the way things were." The way things were. Abigail exhausted and angry. Joey crying for a mother who couldn't answer. Maggie silent as stone. The house slowly dying around them while he worked himself to exhaustion, trying to be two parents and failing at both. "I can't ask her that," James said quietly. "Marriage of convenience for legal protection. She deserves better." "Does she? Or do you just think she does because you feel guilty about wanting her?" Tom's voice was gentle but firm. "Rebecca's letter," James started, then stopped. Tom waited. "She told me to find someone," James finished. "To live, not just exist. But I don't know if I'm choosing Ayanna because I love her or because I'm desperate." "Could be both," Tom said. "Could be that desperation and love aren't as different as we pretend. Either way, you've got 3 days to decide." Tom rode off, leaving James alone with thoughts that chased themselves in circles. In the distance, he could hear Joey's laughter, bright and uncomplicated. The sound of a child who was healing because someone had stayed. That night, after the children slept, Ayanna sat in the barn with a stub of candle and paper she'd borrowed from Abigail's school supplies. The letter to Sister Maria had been started and abandoned 3 times. Words felt too small for what she needed to say. Finally, she wrote simply, "Dearest Maria, I'm healing here, not just them, me. For the first time since the canyon, since the blood and the silence, I wake up and feel something other than the obligation to continue breathing. I feel purpose. I feel needed. I feel like maybe the world didn't end that day in 1880, just changed shape. But I'm terrified. What if they learn to love me, and then the town forces me to leave? What if I love them and have to walk away? What if I'm building a home on land that was never meant to be mine? Joey calls me Mama now, not Mama Ayanna, just Mama. It breaks my heart and rebuilds it at the same time." She paused, the candle flickering shadows across unfinished sentences. The barn door opened quietly. Ayanna folded the letter quickly, but it was only Abigail, wrapped in a shawl, against the autumn chill. "Can't sleep?" the girl asked. "Too many thoughts," Ayanna said. Abigail sat down on a hay bale nearby, close, but not touching. They'd developed this pattern over the weeks, proximity without pressure, presence without demands. "Pa's scared," Abigail said after a moment. "I can tell. He gets quiet when he's scared, like if he doesn't say it out loud, it won't be real." "What's he scared of?" "Losing you." Abigail looked at her directly. "Losing us. Losing everything again." Ayanna's chest tightened. "I don't want to leave." "Then don't." "It might not be my choice." Abigail's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "Everything's a choice. You taught me that. When Henry got bit by that snake, you chose to suck the venom even though it could have killed you. When those boys in town made fun of Ben, you chose to stand up even though it could have made things worse. You choose every day to stay here, even though it's hard." "This is different," Ayanna said quietly. "The town council can force me to leave. The law is on their side." "Then we'll find another law." Abigail stood fierce and young and certain in the way only 13-year-olds can be. "You're my family now, I choose that. And I'm my mother's daughter. We don't quit." She left before Ayanna could respond, leaving behind the kind of loyalty that felt like armor and burden at the same time. Ayanna didn't finish the letter. Instead, she blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of a ranch slowly becoming home. The horse approached so quietly she almost missed it. Apache trained moving like shadow. Ayanna was on her feet instantly, hand on the knife. She always carried a habit from 6 years of knowing that safety was temporary and violence could arrive between one breath and the next. "Peace, little cousin," came a voice from the darkness. "I come as family, not threat." Red Skywalker emerged into the moonlight, ancient and solid, riding a paint horse that was probably older than most of the buildings in Lincoln County. He dismounted with the slow care of a man whose joints remembered every winter, every wound, every year of surviving in a world that wanted him gone. "Uncle," Ayanna breathed, using the Apache term that meant both relation and respect. "I thought you were on the reservation." "Sometimes I wander." Red Sky set his face creasing into something that might have been a smile if the world hadn't beaten most of his smiles out of him decades ago. "Reservations are prisons with paperwork. I prefer my chains, to be honest." They sat together on the corral fence, two Apache people, on stolen land beneath stars that had watched their ancestors hunt and love and die in these mountains long before white men decided to draw borders. "The elders hear things," Red Sky said eventually. "They hear James Hartwell's Apache woman is causing trouble in Lincoln County. They hear Clayton wants blood or money, probably both. They hear you've chosen white children over your people." Ayanna stiffened. "I haven't chosen against anyone. I'm just healing where I'm needed." "Peace," Red Sky said again. "I'm not accusing, just reporting what fear makes people say. But I brought you something." He pulled a small bundle from his coat wrapped in worn leather. Even before he opened it, Ayanna knew what it was. The smell alone told her. Sage and cedar and something else, something that carried memory like smoke carries messages. "Your grandmother's medicine bundle," Red Sky said. "We found it in the canyon after. Kept it safe, waiting for you to be ready." Ayanna's hands shook as she took it. Inside were tools and herbs and small sacred items she'd watched her grandmother use 1,000 times. A life's worth of healing knowledge contained in objects that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't understand the language of plants and prayers. "She would want you to use it without shame," Red Sky said. "She healed everyone who asked, Apache, Mexican, white. She used to say, sickness doesn't care about borders, so neither should medicine." "The town wants me gone," Ayanna said, her voice breaking slightly. "They're scared of what I represent. They're scared of what they don't understand," Red Sky corrected. "White man's fear is like prairie fire. Spreads fast, burns, everything leaves ash. But ash makes good soil. Sometimes destruction is just preparation for new growth." He stood, his knees creaking with the sound of too many years on horseback. "You carry your mother's gift," he said. "Use it. The children need you. The man needs you. And maybe you need them too. Roots don't care what soil they're planted in, little cousin. They grow where they're tended." He mounted his horse, then paused. "Friday's town council meeting. I'll be there. You won't see me, but I'll be there. Sometimes the old Apache watching is enough to remind white men that we're not all dead yet." He rode into the darkness, leaving Ayanna holding her grandmother's bundle and crying for the first time since Sister Maria had found her in that canyon 6 years ago. The 3 days passed too quickly and too slowly, time doing that strange thing it does when you're waiting for something that will change everything. James gathered his allies. Doc Pierce agreed to testify. Sarah McAllister promised to speak. Tom Reeves would stand with them. But Marcus Clayton was gathering too. On Thursday night, James found Ayanna in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. She was making bread, her hands working the dough with the kind of focused intensity that meant she was thinking about something else entirely. "If speaking for you costs me this ranch," James said without preamble, "I'll lose it loudly." Ayanna looked up, flour dusting her dark hands white. "And if staying costs you your children's future, my children's future is having someone who loves them," James said. "That's you. The town council might not see it that way. Then they're blind." Ayanna set down the dough, wiped her hands. "James, I need you to understand something. If tomorrow goes badly, I'll leave. Not because I want to, but because I won't let your children suffer for the town's fear." "They'll suffer more if you go," James said. "Joey barely remembers life before you. Maggie talks now. Ben stands up for himself. Even Abigail smiles. You did that." "Partnership means both people get to speak," Ayanna said quietly. "You taught me that. So hear me speak. I love those children. I love this life. I might even love you, though I'm terrified to say it out loud because loving things has always meant losing them." James crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, took her flour-dusted hands in his calloused ones. "I loved Rebecca," he said. "She was my first everything, but she's gone and I'm still here. And so are 6 kids who need more than a father going through motions. They need you, I need you, not as hired help, as family." "The law says I can't be family without marriage," Ayanna said. "Then marry me," James said. "Not for convenience, not for legal protection, because I choose you, Ayanna. Because you make me remember what hope feels like." Before she could answer, before the moment could become more than it was, horses thundered into the yard. Torches, voices, the sound of men who'd been drinking and thinking and deciding that fear was easier than understanding. Marcus Clayton sat his horse at the head of 6 riders, his face illuminated by firelight, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Hartwell," he called, "come out. We need to talk about tomorrow." James grabbed his rifle. Ayanna grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "That's what he wants. Violence gives him excuse. And doing nothing gives him victory." "No," Ayanna said. "Doing nothing gives him tonight. Tomorrow we fight with words and witnesses. Tonight we survive." James stepped onto the porch rifle, lowered but visible. Ayanna stood beside him, unarmed but unflinching. "Get off my property, Marcus," James said. "Just wanted to save you the trip tomorrow," Marcus said pleasantly, like they were discussing weather instead of threats. "Brought you a present. Show them, boys." One of the riders pushed forward a man Ayanna recognized. Apache young, maybe 20, with bruises fresh on his face and fear in his eyes. "Caught him stealing cattle 2 days ago," Marcus said. "From your north pasture, matter of fact. Witnesses saw him. He confessed. Now I'm wondering, Hartwell, if you're harboring one Apache thief, maybe you're harboring others. Maybe your healer woman here is part of a whole conspiracy." It was brilliant and terrible. A lie wrapped in enough truth that simple people would believe it. The Apache man had probably been on Hartwell land, probably because he was starving and reservation rations were designed to kill slowly. But Marcus had turned survival into theft and association into conspiracy. "That's a lie," Ayanna said clearly. "Is it?" Marcus's smile widened. "Tomorrow the council votes. They'll hear about this. They'll hear about Apache presence bringing crime. They'll vote to expel you, and James here will have to choose between his Indian woman and his children's safety. Or," Marcus continued, "you could just leave tonight. Spare everyone the trouble. I'll even drop the charges against this one here, my gift to you." The Apache man's eyes met Ayanna's. She saw the plea there, the exhaustion, the understanding that he was a pawn in a game much bigger than one man's hunger. "I'll see you at the council meeting," Ayanna said, "with the truth." Marcus laughed. "Truth is what people choose to believe, and people are very scared right now." He wheeled his horse, his men following. The Apache prisoner went with them, disappearing into darkness. Inside the house, 6 children huddled by the window. Joey was crying. Abigail's face was white. They'd heard everything. James pulled them all close. Ayanna stood separate, watching her grandmother's medicine bundle heavy in her pocket. "Tomorrow," James said to his children, "we fight. Together." Abigail looked at Ayanna. "You're not leaving?" "No," Ayanna said, making the choice, even as fear screamed that it was the wrong one. "I'm not leaving." "Good," Abigail said, "because we're not done being your family yet." In the distance, Marcus Clayton's torches faded like falling stars, leaving only darkness and the cold promise of morning. Friday arrived wearing the face of Judgment Day. The Lincoln Town Hall was a squat building of weathered wood and fading paint, the kind of structure built by people who believed function mattered more than beauty. By 9 in the morning, every bench was packed. Standing room filled next. People clustered at the windows, pressed against walls, spilled out onto the porch where they could hear, if not see. This wasn't about permits or legal residency anymore. Everyone knew it. This was theater, public execution dressed up as democracy. James Hartwell sat in the front row with his 6 children arranged around him like a fortress. Abigail held Joey on her lap, the 4-year-old unusually still, sensing the weight of adult tension even if he couldn't name it. Ben sat rigid, his freckled face set in an expression of fierce determination copied from his father. Maggie held Lily's hand. Henry clutched a smooth river stone in his pocket the way children do when they need something solid to prove the world is real. Ayanna sat beside them, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her simplest dress, her hair braided tight, her grandmother's medicine bundle hidden beneath her shawl. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had survived massacres and grief, and 6 years of being told her existence was an inconvenience to people who had stolen her world and then complained about her presence in the ruins. Wade Clayton sat at the raised table that served as the council bench, flanked by 4 other men whose faces ranged from uncomfortable to hostile. The sheriff's badge on Wade's chest caught the morning light streaming through the windows, turning it into something that looked almost righteous if you didn't look too close at the eyes beneath. Marcus Clayton sat in the front row opposite his posture, relaxed, his smile slight. He'd already won and everyone knew it. This was just the paperwork. The room smelled of unwashed bodies and tension, and coffee gone cold in tin cups. Someone coughed. A baby fussed in the back and was quickly shushed. The sound of pages turning as Wade shuffled meaningless documents filled the silence with false importance. "This council is convened," Wade said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who'd never questioned whether he deserved the power he wielded to address concerns regarding the presence of an Apache woman on the Hartwell property and the potential threat to community safety. Potential threat. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ayanna felt them settle on her skin, familiar as old scars. She'd been a potential threat her entire life. To soldiers who saw Apache and thought savage. To settlers who saw brown skin and thought less than. To men like Marcus Clayton, who saw a woman alone and thought easy to remove. "We'll hear testimony," Wade continued. "Then we'll vote. Marcus, you want to start?" Marcus stood all false courtesy and calculated charm. He nodded to the crowd like a politician, like a man who cared about their welfare instead of their fear. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said. "I'll be brief. 2 nights ago, my men apprehended an Apache man stealing cattle from land adjacent to the Hartwell Ranch. He confessed, said he'd been camping in the area for weeks." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Planned murmurs Ayanna suspected. Marcus had packed the room with sympathetic voices. "Now, I'm not saying Miss—" He paused, made a show of uncertainty. "I'm sorry, what's your Christian name?" "I don't have one," Ayanna said clearly. "Ayanna is my name. It means eternal blossom in my language." "Your language," Marcus repeated, as if the very concept was evidence of foreignness. "Well, I'm not saying Miss Ayanna is directly involved in cattle theft, but her presence sends a signal. It tells other Apache that this area is friendly to them, that they can come and go freely. And when they come, they bring trouble." He turned to address the crowd directly, now a preacher working his congregation. "We've all heard the stories from down south. Apache raids, settlers killed, children taken. Now I know times have changed. I know most Apache are on reservations now, peaceful and contained. But can we really risk it? Can we really say that having one of them living among us, unmarked, unsponsored, is safe for our children?" The word children did its work. Faces hardened, women pulled their babies closer. Men's hands moved unconsciously to weapons that weren't there, muscle memory from a frontier that existed more in imagination than reality now, but fear didn't care about facts. "How do we know she's not signaling others?" Marcus continued. "How do we know this isn't the beginning of something bigger? Apache uprisings have happened before. They could happen again." He sat down satisfied. The damage was done. Fear planted, watered, ready to grow. Wade looked at Ayanna. "You got anything to say to that?" Ayanna stood slowly. Every eye in the room followed her movement, tracking her like she was something dangerous, something wild that might bolt or attack at any moment. "I have plenty to say," Ayanna said. "But according to your laws, I'm not a citizen, so why would my words matter to this council? Now hold on," Wade started, but Ayanna cut him off, her voice steady and cold as winter rivers. "I'm not a citizen. I can't vote. I can't own land. I can't testify in court against a white man, but I can be judged by you. I can be expelled by you. I can have my life destroyed by your fear and your votes." "That's an interesting version of justice." The room went silent. No one had expected the Apache woman to have teeth. I'm human, Ayanna continued. That should be citizenship enough. I heal the sick. I tend the wounded. I ask nothing except the chance to use the gifts my grandmother gave me before your soldiers killed her and everyone I loved. If that makes me a threat, then your definition of threat is broken. She sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her face remained calm. Wade's jaw worked. He hadn't expected resistance. Anyone else want to speak? Doc Pierce stood his 65 years, evident in the way he rose careful of joints that had set too many bones and carried too much weight. He was respected in Lincoln County, one of those rare men whose competence had earned him authority beyond his profession. I'll speak, Doc said. I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 30 years. I've seen every kind of healer from educated surgeons to snake oil salesmen. Miss Ayanna is the real thing. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, opened it to marked pages. 3 weeks ago, she saved Joey Hartwell from pneumonia using willow bark and yarrow when I was too far away to help. 2 weeks ago, she treated Henry Hartwell for rattlesnake bite with technique so perfect I couldn't have improved it. Last week, she cured an ear infection in Maggie Hartwell that I'd been trying to fix for a month. Doc looked directly at Marcus. She's also treated Sarah McAllister's niece for croup old Tom Brennan for infected wound and half a dozen other folks who were too proud to mention they'd gone to an Apache healer but desperate enough to try when white medicine failed them. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Doc had just called out the hypocrisy, and hypocrisy hates being named. She's more qualified than half the doctors in New Mexico territory, Doc finished. And if you expel her, you're not protecting this town. You're condemning it to suffer from treatable illness because you're too scared to see past skin color. He sat down hard, his point made. Sarah McAllister stood next her general store apron still on flour dust in her graying hair. She was a practical woman, a widow who'd built a business in a man's world through sheer stubborn competence. She teaches my niece kindness, Sarah said simply. Teaches her about plants and patience and seeing people as people instead of categories. That's not a threat. That's exactly what this town needs. Tom Reeves stood. James Hartwell's been my neighbor 10 years. His judgment is sound. If he says she's good people, that's enough for me. One by one, others stood. Not many, not a majority, but enough to show the room wasn't unanimous in its fear. A farmer whose infection Ayanna had treated. A woman whose difficult childbirth Ayanna had attended when Doc was in Santa Fe. Small voices, quiet rebellion against the tyranny of collective terror, and then Joey Hartwell, 4 years old, and too young to understand politics, but old enough to know love squirmed out of Abigail's lap and toddled across the open space to Ayanna. The room held its breath. Joey climbed into Ayanna's lap, settled there like he belonged, and looked at the council with the uncomplicated certainty of childhood. Mama Yaya, he said the nickname he'd given her that first week, simple and devastating in its innocence. The image froze in the room's collective consciousness. A white child, blonde and blue-eyed, trusting completely in the arms of an Apache woman. Some faces softened, others hardened, but no one could look away. Marcus stood abruptly, his calm cracking slightly. Very touching, but sentiment doesn't change law. Sheriff Clayton, there's a territorial code that applies here, isn't there? Wade looked uncomfortable for the first time. He pulled out a document, old and official, looking the kind of paper that carried the weight of history's mistakes. Lincoln County Code 47. Wade read reluctantly. No person of Indian blood may reside within county limits without sponsorship through marriage to a white citizen in good standing. It's an old law, someone called from the back. Territorial days. Nobody enforces it. It's still law, Marcus said triumphantly. Is James Hartwell married to her? All eyes turned to James. He stood slowly, Joey still in Ayanna's arms, his 5 other children watching with faces that held hope and fear in equal measure. No, James said. I'm not married to her. Then by law she's residing here illegally, Marcus said. She has to leave. The trap was sprung. Either Ayanna left or James faced charges of harboring illegal residents. Either way, Marcus won. The land would be vulnerable. The family would be broken. Fear would reign. James looked at Ayanna. Really looked the way a man does when he's about to make a choice that will define the rest of his life. Then I'll marry her, James said. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, some shocked, some angry, some quietly approving. Wade banged his gavel for order, the sound lost in the chaos. Ayanna stared at James Joey, still in her arms, her eyes wide. James, no, she said quietly, but he heard her anyway. Not pity, James said loud enough for the room to hear. Not convenience, choice. I choose you, Ayanna. I choose the woman who saved my son's life, who brought laughter back to my house, who taught my children that healing matters more than hate. He crossed to her, knelt down so they were eye level, despite Joey between them. "Do you choose us?" he asked. Ayanna looked at the 6 faces watching her, Abigail fierce and loyal, Ben brave and trying not to cry, Maggie finally finding her voice, Henry with his rocks and questions, Lily with her newfound courage, Joey with his absolute trust. She looked at James at the exhaustion and hope and love tangled together in his expression. She thought of her grandmother's voice. Healing is healing, child. Family is family. Love is love. "Yes," Ayanna said. "I choose you, all of you." The room exploded again, but James was smiling now, and so was Ayanna, and the children were laughing and crying at once. Wade banged the gavel until the noise subsided. His face was complicated, torn between brother loyalty and the uncomfortable realization that James had just outmaneuvered Marcus, using Marcus's own weapon. "Fine," Wade said. "Marriage satisfies Code 47. But," he raised his voice over the beginning murmurs, "the ceremony must be witnessed by 20 citizens of Lincoln County who approve the union. Let's see if you can find 20 people willing to stand with an Apache woman." Marcus smiled. It was the smile of a man with a backup plan. 20 witnesses in a town this size with this much fear, with Marcus's influence over business and credit and social standing. It was impossible. "You've got until Monday," Wade said. "No 20 witnesses, no marriage, she leaves." He banged the gavel. "Council adjourned." People filed out slowly, voices low, casting glances at James and Ayanna that ranged from sympathy to disgust. Marcus left looking satisfied. Wade left looking troubled. Outside on the town hall steps, James and Ayanna stood with 6 children and an impossible task. Find 20 people willing to publicly support an Apache woman in a town run by fear. Doc Pierce stepped forward first. "I'll stand, that's one." Sarah McAllister nodded. "Me too, 2. Tom Reeves and his wife. 4. Slowly, hesitantly, others emerged from the dispersing crowd. The woman whose baby Ayanna had delivered, the farmer she'd treated, a few brave souls who valued conscience over social standing. They counted, reached 12, then 15, 17, 19. The gathering stopped. People looked at each other, waiting for someone else to be the 20th, to be the one who completed the circle, but also marked themselves forever as the person who chose the Apache woman. The silence stretched, became painful. 19 faces waiting, 1 voice needed. Abigail Hartwell, 13 years old, stepped forward. "I'm not an adult," she said clearly. "Not legally, but I'll stand. I'm the 20th. Wade, still lingering on the porch, shook his head. "You're 13. Doesn't count." "Then she doesn't count either," Abigail said, gesturing to Ayanna. "Apache aren't citizens, but you're still judging her. So if she counts for judgment, I count for witness." She looked at Ayanna, her young face fierce with the same determination her mother must have had. "Family isn't who birthed you," Abigail said loud enough for the lingering crowd to hear. "It's who stays when you're breaking." Ayanna stayed. "She's my mother now. She's my... And I'll stand for her, even if no one else will." The words hung in the morning air, sharp and clean as broken glass, cutting through fear to something truer underneath. From the edge of the crowd, a figure emerged, old Apache wrapped in traditional dress that marked him as other in every way that mattered to people who counted such things. Red Sky Walker moved like water, slow but inevitable. "I'm Apache," Red Sky said. "I'm a citizen of nowhere your laws recognize, but I'm her family, blood family, and I stand." Wade stared. The trap was closing, but not the way Marcus had planned. The 20 witnesses were assembled, impossible as it seemed. Fear had lost 1 round. "Monday morning," Wade said finally. "Sunrise. I'll perform the ceremony myself." He left Marcus following both men already planning the next move. Because men, like Marcus Clayton, always had a next move. On the ridge above town, Bart Simmons sat his horse, watching. Beside him, 4 men with rough faces and rougher intentions. Marcus had given clear instructions. If the law couldn't remove the Apache woman, then something else would have to. Tonight, when families slept and witnesses scattered, when fire spoke louder than votes, Plan B was always simpler than democracy. It just required matches and the willingness to burn down everything a man loved to get what you wanted. The night before the wedding, the Hartwell Ranch settled into an uneasy peace that felt less like calm and more like the moment before lightning strikes. Ayanna and the children decorated the front room with what they had: wildflowers in tin cans, clean tablecloths borrowed from Sarah McAllister. Abigail's best attempt at a cake cooling on the windowsill, lopsided but made with love. Joey insisted on hanging ribbons he'd traded his favorite rock for in town blue and white streamers that caught the lamplight and turned the worn room into something almost magical. "It looks like a real wedding," Lily said, her 6-year-old voice full of wonder. "It is a real wedding," Maggie corrected, 13 months younger, but lately convinced she knew everything. Ben and Henry argued quietly about whether the chairs should be in rows or a circle. Abigail mediated with the tired patience of someone who'd been mediating sibling disputes since she was old enough to speak. The normalcy of it all, the simple domestic chaos, felt like armor against the darkness, gathering just beyond the lamplight's reach. James stood on the porch, ostensibly checking the evening chores, but really just watching the horizon. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, the night birds too quiet. After 36 years on this land, most of them spent learning to read weather and trouble. In equal measure, he'd developed instincts that rarely lied. Tom Reeves had ridden by at sunset with a warning. Marcus had been drinking in the saloon all afternoon, buying rounds, talking loud about justice and protecting the territory from savages. Wade had been there too quieter, but his presence felt like permission, the kind of tacit approval that turned drunk talk into drunk action. "You should keep watch tonight," Tom had said, "just to be safe." Safe. As if anywhere was safe when powerful men decided you'd embarrass them in public. James checked his rifle for the 3rd time, made sure the shotgun was loaded and within reach. He hated the necessity of it, hated that the night before his wedding had to include contingency plans for violence. But hate didn't change reality. Inside, Ayanna felt it too, the wrongness. She'd survived too many attacks, both the kind that came with soldiers and dawn light, and the kind that came with angry settlers and darkness, not to recognize the particular quality of air before violence arrived. She moved through the house methodically, checking that the children knew where to hide if something happened. The root cellar, the space under the stairs, places small bodies could fit and wait and hopefully survive. "You're scaring them," James said quietly when she came back outside. "Better scared and prepared than surprised and dead," Ayanna replied. They stood together in the darkness, not touching, but closely united in the vigil. Waiting for trouble they both knew was coming, but couldn't quite see the shape of yet. Midnight arrived with the smell of smoke. Ayanna woke first, her body trained by years of light sleeping in mission infirmaries where emergencies arrived without warning. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Wood burning where wood shouldn't be burning. She was out of bed and moving before conscious thought caught up. Down the hall past the children's rooms, through the front door where James was already standing, rifle in hand, staring at the barn. Orange light flickered in the gaps between boards. Smoke poured from the hayloft. The horses inside screamed high and terrible, the sound of animals who understood fire even if they couldn't escape it. "The barn," James said, unnecessarily already running. Ayanna ran too, toward the flames, toward the danger, because that's what you did when things you loved were burning. They reached the doors together, threw them open, were met with a wall of heat and smoke that drove them back gasping. The horses bolted past them into the night, wild-eyed and trailing smoke. Small mercies. At least the animals would live. And then the riders came. 5 men on horseback circling the yard like wolves, torches held high, faces covered with bandanas, but bodies recognizable. Bart Simmons led them, his bulk unmistakable even in shadow. Marcus Clayton's foreman doing Marcus Clayton's dirty work because powerful men rarely dirtied their own hands. "This is what happens when you defy Clayton," Bart shouted over the roar of flames. "This is what happens when you choose savages over your own kind." James raised his rifle but didn't fire. Shooting at 5 armed men while his children were in the house was suicide, wearing the mask of courage. Ayanna's mind raced through options, all of them bad. Run, and they'd be hunted. Fight, and they'd be killed. Stay and watch everything burn. And then she heard the scream, high, terrified. Unmistakably Joey's voice coming from inside the house, but wrong moving, getting further away. Ayanna spun toward the sound in time to see Bart Simmons at Joey's bedroom window, the 4-year-old clutched under one massive arm, Joey's small fists beating uselessly against the man's chest. "No!" The word tore from Ayanna's throat, primal and desperate. Bart grinned behind his bandana, his eyes cruel above the cloth. "Come get him, Indian woman. Let's see if your Apache magic can track in the dark." He spurred his horse hard, Joey's screams fading as they disappeared into the night, the other riders following their torches, bobbing like malevolent stars. James was already moving toward his horse, but Ayanna caught his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice deadly calm, despite the terror screaming through her veins. "Running blind gets him killed. They have my son, and we'll get him back." Ayanna's eyes were hard as flint, but smart, not stupid. The barn collapsed behind them, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like dying stars. The other children spilled from the house, Abigail herding them, all of them white-faced and shaking. "Joey," Abigail gasped. "Where's Joey?" "Taken," James said the word like ash in his mouth. "Marcus's men took him." "Then we go after them," Abigail said fiercely. "All of us." "No." Ayanna's voice cut through the panic like a blade. "You five stay together. Do not come out. Do not open the door for anyone except us. Understand?" Five heads nodded, terror making them obedient in a way normal parenting never could. Ayanna turned to James. "We go together. I track, you protect. Partnership. You can track at night. Apache women learn to track in darkness before we learn to walk in light," Ayanna said. "My grandmother could follow a snake across stone by moonlight. I'm not that good, but I'm good enough for five drunk white men who think they're clever." They mounted James's remaining horse together, Ayanna in front, where she could see the ground, James behind with his rifle. The children watched from the doorway, silhouetted against lamplight, looking smaller and more vulnerable than any children should have to look. "We'll bring him home," James called to them. Abigail nodded, pulled the others back inside, barred the door. 13 years old and already carrying the weight of impossible responsibility. The tracks were easy at first. 5 horses moving fast, careless, leaving gouges in the dirt deep enough to read by starlight. Ayanna followed them with the same focused intensity she brought to healing, reading the story the earth told in hoofprints and disturbed grass. "They're heading north," she said, "toward Marcus's ranch." "Cocky," James muttered. "They're not even trying to hide. Why would they? They think we're helpless. White man's arrogance thinking Apache don't bite back." Ayanna's voice was cold, colder than James had ever heard it, and he realized he was seeing something new. Not the healer who sang to fevered children, not the woman who taught Lily to make dream catchers with gentle hands. This was the survivor of massacres, the woman who'd walked out of a canyon full of her family's corpses and kept living out of pure stubborn refusal to let murderers have the final word. This was dangerous Ayanna, Apache Ayanna, the part of her that remembered how to fight before Christianity tried to teach her to turn the other cheek. They rode in silence, following the tracks across open grassland, past Tom Reeves's darkened ranch toward the cluster of buildings that marked Marcus Clayton's property. Bigger than James's spread, richer, built on the backs of smaller ranchers, foreclosed and land bought cheap from desperate men. Lights blazed in the main house despite the late hour. Men moved in the yard, their voices carrying on the still air, celebratory and cruel. They'd won, or thought they had. Taken the child, burned the barn, sent the message that Apache women and the white men who defended them would not be tolerated. Ayanna and James dismounted at the tree line, hidden in shadows, watching. Through the window of a small outbuilding, a storage cabin or bunkhouse, they could see Joey. The boy sat on the floor, his face streaked with tears, surrounded by men who laughed and drank and passed a bottle, not hurting him, not yet, but the threat was implicit. "Behave, or things get worse." "I'm going in," James said, checking his rifle. "And do what? Shoot 5 men while your son is in the crossfire?" Ayanna's hand on his arm was iron. "No, we do this my way." She pulled her grandmother's medicine bundle from her dress, removed a small carved whistle made from eagle bone, put it to her lips and blew. No sound came out, at least none that James could hear. But somewhere in the darkness, something answered. Movement in the trees. Shapes resolving into men. 7 of them, Apache warriors dressed for night hunting, paint on their faces that turned them into shadows with teeth. Red Skywalker led them, old but still dangerous, still carrying the warrior knowledge that reservations tried to beat out of young men but could never quite erase from the old. "You called little cousin," Red Sky said quietly. "We came." "They took the boy," Ayanna said. White child, Apache justice. Red Sky's smile was terrible and beautiful. "All children are sacred. These men forgot that. Time to remind them." The Apache warriors fanned out, silent as smoke encircling the buildings. James watched with something like awe. This was the fighting force that had held off the U.S. Army for decades, that had made the Southwest run red before superior numbers and Gatling guns finally won through sheer mechanical atrocity. These 7 men, even diminished by age and reservation life, were more dangerous than Marcus's entire crew of drunk bullies. Ayanna moved forward, James beside her, Red Sky and his warriors invisible in the darkness. They crossed the yard, bold as daylight, no more hiding. Surprise was less valuable than certainty now. Marcus emerged from the main house, Bart beside him, both men's faces showing the shock of seeing their plan unraveling. "Come for the boy," Marcus called, recovering quickly, his hand moving toward his gun. "Interesting. Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to walk right into my hands, Hartwell." "Give him back," James said, his voice flat and hard. "This is between you and me. Leave the child out of it." "Can't do that," Marcus said. See, I needed leverage. Needed something to make you understand that you don't get to embarrass me in front of the whole county and walk away clean. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice calm and cold as winter rivers. You took our child, she said. That was your last mistake. Marcus laughed. Your child, he's white. You're just the hired help, pretending to be family. Family isn't blood, Ayanna said. Family is choice. We chose him. He chose us. And you just declared war on a family that includes Apache warriors. She whistled again, sharper this time. The signal she'd sent earlier when they first spotted Marcus's ranch had been answered. Red Skywalker had been tracking them since sunset, waiting for the moment to strike. Red Skywalker and his 6 men emerged from shadows surrounding the yard rifles and bows trained on Marcus's men with the kind of casual competence that came from decades of surviving by violence when violence was the only language the invaders understood. Marcus's face went white. Bart's hand froze on his gun. You took our cousin's child, Red Sky said, his voice carrying the weight of every broken treaty, every massacre, every promise the white men made and shattered. We take offense to that. This is white man's land, Marcus stammered. Red Sky's laugh was bitter as alkali water. This is everyone's land. You stole it from us first, built your houses on our graves, wrote laws that said we couldn't exist in the places our ancestors hunted for 10,000 years, and now you lecture us about legal residence. The cabin door opened. Bart shoved Joey outside, the boy stumbling, crying, running straight to Ayanna, who caught him and held him like he was made of spun glass and second chances. There, Bart said. Take the brat. We're done here. No, came a new voice. You're not. Wade Clayton rode into the yard with Tom Reeves and 3 deputies, all armed, all wearing expressions that said the game had changed fundamentally. Wade looked at his brother and something complex and painful moved across his face. Love and duty wrestling for territory that couldn't hold both. Marcus, Wade said quietly, you've gone too far. I'm your brother. And you're a criminal, Wade said. Arson, kidnapping, extortion. I'm the law, Marcus. Even for you, I'm still the law. The standoff held 7 Apache warriors, 4 deputies, Marcus and his men, caught between them, the night air thick with the potential for violence that could spill in any direction. Drop your weapons, Wade ordered. All of you. Marcus Clayton, Bart Simmons, you're under arrest. You can't be serious, Marcus said. Dead serious. Wade's voice was heavy with the weight of choosing law over blood. Town saw you threaten them, saw you pack that council meeting with fear, and now you've burned a man's barn and stolen his child. That's not politics anymore. That's crime. Slowly, reluctantly, Marcus's men dropped their guns. Bart looked ready to fight, but Marcus put a hand on his arm, shook his head. The calculation was clear. Resist and die, or submit and hire lawyers. Marcus was a survivor. He'd picked the option that let him wake up tomorrow. The deputies moved in iron shackles, clicking closed around wrists that had never expected to wear them. Marcus stared at Wade, betrayal raw on his face. You chose them over family, Marcus said. No, Wade replied. I chose law over lawlessness. There's a difference. As they led Marcus away, Wade stopped beside James and Ayanna. Joey clung to Ayanna, his face buried in her shoulder, his small body shaking with the aftermath of terror. I'm sorry, Wade said quietly, for what it's worth. It's worth something, James said. Not everything, but something. Wade nodded and rode away, taking his brother toward a jail cell and a trial that would reshape Lincoln County's power structure forever. Red Skywalker and his warriors melted back into the darkness as silently as they'd come. Before he vanished completely, Red Sky caught Ayanna's eye. Family protects family, he said. Remember that when they try to tell you Apache ways are savage, we protect our children. Can they say the same? Then he was gone, a ghost, reclaiming the night, leaving only the memory of what justice looked like when it wore paint instead of badges. The ride home was quiet. Joey fell asleep against Ayanna's chest, exhausted by fear and relief. James rode behind them, one arm around Ayanna's waist, holding both of them steady. The barn was still smoldering when they arrived, but the house stood intact. The 5 children spilled out the door at the sound of hoofbeats, Abigail in the lead, and the reunion was tears and laughter and everyone talking at once. Is he hurt? Abigail demanded, checking Joey for injuries. He's fine, Ayanna said. Scared but fine. We're all fine. They gathered in the front room, all 8 of them holding each other in the lamplight, while the ruins of the barn cooled outside. Tomorrow would bring challenges. A barn to rebuild, a trial to attend, a wedding that would mark them forever as the family that chose love over fear. But tonight they were together, whole, alive. And that was enough. Dawn broke over Lincoln County like a promise the world wasn't entirely sure it could keep. Word had arrived in the night. Marcus Clayton and Bart Simmons, tried and convicted yesterday afternoon while the ashes of the barn were still warm, would spend the next decade in territorial prison. Wade Clayton had chosen law over blood, and Lincoln County was still processing what that meant. But this morning wasn't about Marcus's fall. This morning was about something rarer, about choosing love over fear, about a wedding. The Hartwell Ranch looked like a battlefield after the smoke cleared. Blackened timbers where the barn had stood, scorch marks on the grass, the acrid smell of destruction hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. But the house stood. The children slept, finally exhausted by terror and relief, and in the kitchen, James and Ayanna sat across from each other with coffee. Neither of them was drinking, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. "We should postpone," James said quietly. "The wedding. Give things time to settle." "No," Ayanna said. "We do it today, as planned. We don't let fear win twice." James looked at her, really looked, seeing the steel beneath the gentleness. This was a woman who'd walked out of massacre, who'd spent 6 years rebuilding herself from grief into purpose, who'd faced down armed men to save a child that wasn't hers by blood, but was absolutely hers by choice. "I love you," he said. The words came out simple and true, unplanned, inevitable. Ayanna's breath caught. "James, I need you to know that before we do this, before we stand in front of the town and make it legal. This isn't just about Code 47 or keeping you here or protecting the children. I choose you because you make me remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving." He reached across the table, took her hand. Calloused palm against scarred palm, two people who'd worked too hard and lost too much, finding each other in the ruins. "I loved Rebecca," James continued. "She was my first everything. But she's gone and you're here, and I'm done pretending that's not the best thing that's happened to this family in 2 years." Ayanna's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "I can't give you more children." The words came out raw, the fear she'd been carrying since the moment she'd started to care about this man and his family. "The massacre." She continued, her voice steady despite the breaking underneath. "The soldiers didn't just kill. They destroyed. I was hurt badly. The mission doctor said the damage was permanent. I can heal others, but I can't create life." She pulled her hand back, looked away. "You deserve someone who can give you sons and daughters, someone whole." James stood, moved around the table, knelt beside her chair, so they were eye level. "You think I want you for breeding stock?" His voice was fierce, almost angry. "You think these 6 children aren't enough, Ayanna? You gave me my family back. You gave Joey his smile, Maggie her voice, Abigail her childhood. You gave me hope. That's not broken. That's the opposite of broken." "But the future," Ayanna started. "The future is 6 children who already call you Mama," James said. "The future is a life we build together, whatever shape it takes. I choose you. These kids are ours. This life is ours. That's enough." Ayanna looked at him, searched his face for doubt or pity, or the subtle disappointment men learn to hide when women fail to meet expectations. She found none of those things, only honesty, only love that looked like partnership instead of possession. "Then I choose you too," she said. "All of you. Forever." They kissed there in the kitchen, with the smell of smoke still in the air and the ruins of last night's violence visible through the window. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And sometimes real was better than perfect. News arrived before the sun fully rose. Marcus Clayton and Bart Simmons had been convicted the previous afternoon. 10 years for Marcus, 5 for Bart. Their property seized for restitution. Justice for once had worked. Marcus stared at Wade as they led him away in shackles. "You'll regret this." "Probably," Wade said quietly, "but I'll regret it as a man who kept his oath, not a man who broke it for blood." Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in small clusters, processing what had just happened. Power had shifted. The untouchable had been touched. Justice for once had worked the way it was supposed to, instead of the way money wanted it to. Ayanna stood with James and the children, feeling the weight of eyes that were no longer uniformly hostile. Some still were prejudiced, didn't evaporate just because one corrupt man fell. But others showed something different. Respect, maybe. Or at least the grudging acknowledgement that the Apache woman had been right and they had been wrong. Doc Pierce approached, tipped his hat. "Wedding's still on for sunset." "Sunset," James confirmed. "Good," Doc said. "Town could use something hopeful after all this darkness." The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah McAllister arrived with her niece, both of them carrying platters of food. Tom Reeves and 3 other ranchers showed up with lumber, started clearing the barn ruins, and laying foundation for rebuilding. Unasked, unrequested, just the quiet solidarity of neighbors who decided that maybe fear had been a poor guide all along. Abigail pressed Ayanna's only good dress, the dark blue one from the mission. Maggie wove wild flowers into a crown. Lily and Henry practiced standing still, their assigned job as witnesses during the ceremony. Ben polished James's boots until they shone. Joey appointed himself official ribbon guardian and took the job with solemn 4-year-old seriousness. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, people gathered. Not everyone, not even half the town, but enough. The 20 witnesses who'd promised to stand were there, plus others who'd been swayed by the trial, or shamed by their own fear, or simply drawn by the human need to witness love, assert itself in a world that felt increasingly loveless. Wade Clayton arrived in his capacity as sheriff and legal officiant, his face still carrying the weight of what he'd done that morning. He positioned himself at the front of the gathered crowd, Bible in hand, and waited. The children came first, arranged by height, 6 stair steps of hope and nerves and barely contained excitement. They stood in a semicircle, creating the space where their father and Ayanna would make official what their hearts had already decided. James emerged from the house wearing his Sunday best, clean shaven, his hair actually combed for once. He looked young and old, at the same time a man who'd survived grief and was choosing joy, despite knowing how easily it could be taken away. And then Ayanna appeared. She walked alone, no father to give her away, because her father was dust in a canyon 6 years dead, no family except the one she was choosing. The blue dress caught the sunset light. The flower crown sat on her dark hair like a benediction. Her grandmother's medicine bundle hung at her waist, visible and unapologetic. A declaration that she was bringing all of herself to this union. Apache and Christian healer and survivor, broken pieces and beautiful wholeness all mixed together. She walked to James, stood beside him, and Red Skywalker emerged from the crowd to stand behind her. The elder Apache serving as her family witness, her connection to everything she'd lost and everything she carried forward. Wade opened the Bible, cleared his throat, and began. "Dearly beloved," he said, and the familiar words took on new weight in this context, in this moment between these two people who represented everything the territory was trying to figure out how to be. The ceremony was brief. Traditional vows, simple promises, the exchange of plain gold bands that James had traded half a dozen cattle for and considered it the best deal he'd ever made. "Do you, James Hartwell, take this woman?" "I do." "Do you, Ayanna, take this man?" "I do." "Then, by the power vested in me, by Lincoln County and the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife." James kissed Ayanna as the sun touched the mountain peaks, turning the sky to fire, and the witnesses cheered, some loudly, some quietly, but all of them present, all of them choosing to be part of this moment. Joey broke formation, ran to them, hugged both their legs at once. Then Abigail joined, then the others, until all 6 children were tangled together with the 2 adults in a mass of laughter and tears and joy that looked nothing like the formal portraits wealthy families commissioned, but looked exactly like what love actually was. The celebration lasted into the evening. Food appeared on makeshift tables. Someone produced a fiddle. Dancing happened awkward and enthusiastic. Toasts were offered, some graceful, some clumsy, all of them sincere. And then a rider appeared at the edge of the gathering, silhouetted against the last light, and the music stopped. The woman who dismounted was in her 60s, well-dressed in Eastern fashion, carrying herself with the kind of rigid dignity that came from Boston society and the belief that proper behavior could solve any problem. Her face was handsome, but hard grief carved into lines around her mouth and eyes. "I'm looking for James Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the accent of old money and older judgments. James stepped forward. "I'm Hartwell." "Eleanor Blackwood," the woman said. "Rebecca's mother." The name fell into the celebration like a stone, into still water, ripples of tension spreading outward. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said carefully, "I wrote you about Rebecca's passing 2 years ago." "I received the letter," Eleanor said. "I was in Europe. By the time I returned, you'd buried my daughter without me." Her eyes found the children, counted them, softened fractionally. "These are my grandchildren." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's gaze moved to Ayanna, standing beside James, with flower crown wilting and happiness draining from her face as she understood what was happening. "And this is the Apache woman," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. It was an assessment, and the tone suggested the assessment had already reached an unfavorable conclusion. "This is my wife," James said firmly. "Ayanna." "How convenient," Eleanor said, her voice cold as January rivers. Rebecca dead barely 2 years and already replaced with hired help. Ayanna flinched, but didn't step back. Eleanor continued, her purpose becoming clear. I've come to take my grandchildren back to Boston, to give them proper upbringing, proper education, proper society. They've suffered enough tragedy. They don't need to be raised on a failing ranch by a father who puts his needs above their welfare. That's not, James started, but Eleanor cut him off. I have lawyers, Mr. Hartwell. I have means. And I have Boston courts that will look very favorably on a grieving grandmother's request to rescue her grandchildren from poverty and inappropriate influences. She looked at Ayanna again. No offense to you personally, but my daughter's children deserve better than an Apache stepmother. The children had gone silent, pressed close together, fear replacing joy in their young faces. This was a different kind of threat than Marcus Clayton's violence. This was love weaponized family used as a cudgel the law twisted to serve prejudice, wearing the mask of proper concern. Abigail stepped forward. At 13, she was still more child than woman, but something in her stance, in the set of her shoulders, carried Rebecca's strength and James's stubbornness, and something entirely her own. No, Abigail said. Eleanor turned to her, surprised. Abigail, dear, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, grandmother, Abigail said, the word formal and distant. You want to take us away from our home because you think you know better than our father what we need. I do know better, Eleanor said. Boston has schools, culture, opportunities. What does this place have except dust and danger? It has family, Abigail said. It has the only mother we've had since Mama died. It has someone who stayed when things were hard instead of staying away and sending condolence letters 2 years late. Eleanor's face paled. That's not fair. Neither is this, Abigail said. She gestured to her siblings, all of them watching with wide eyes. Ask them. Ask any of us if we want to leave. Eleanor looked at the children, seemed to really see them for the first time. Ben with his freckles and defiant chin, Maggie holding Lily's hand, Henry with his Riverstone clutched tight. Joey pressed against Ayanna's leg, his small face fierce with loyalty. Do you want to come to Boston? Eleanor asked them. Have beautiful things attend, fine schools, meet society. Silence. Then Joey spoke, his 4-year-old voice clear in the evening air. I want to stay with Mama Yaya. Ben nodded. Me too. One by one, they chose. Maggie, Henry, Lily, each of them picking the dusty ranch and the Apache woman over wealth and propriety, and everything Eleanor offered. Abigail spoke last. Family isn't who birthed you, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast but had somehow managed to find truth in the growing. It's who stays when you're breaking. Mama gave us life. Ayanna gave us healing. Both of them gave us love. But Ayanna's here. Ayanna chose us when she didn't have to. That matters. Eleanor stood silent, the wind pulling at her expensive traveling clothes, her face working through emotions that didn't have easy names. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter. Rebecca would want them happy. Yes, James said. She would. And they're happy here, with you, with her. Eleanor looked at Ayanna, really looked, seeing past skin color to the woman underneath. Ask them, Ayanna said softly. Eleanor did, spoke to each child individually, away from adult pressure, asking questions only a grandmother would know to ask. And one by one they told her the truth, about Joey's sickness and Ayanna's healing, about the snake bite, about feeling less alone, about laughter returning to a house that had been silent with grief. When she returned to the gathering, Eleanor looked older and somehow younger at the same time, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying since her daughter died. I can't approve of this marriage, she said to James. I'm too old and too Eastern and too set in my ways to pretend otherwise, but I can see that my grandchildren are loved. That will have to be enough. She turned to Ayanna. Take care of them. With my life, Ayanna said. Ayanna. Eleanor nodded, once mounted her horse, and rode away into the darkness, leaving behind an inheritance she'd planned to claim, and taking with her the wisdom to know when love mattered more than blood. The celebration resumed, quieter now, more thoughtful, but real. At midnight the last guests departed. The children fell asleep in piles on the floor, too tired to make it to beds. James and Ayanna sat on the porch steps, looking at stars that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. Think she'll be back? James asked. Probably, Ayanna said. Grandmothers are persistent, but she'll come as family, not threat. That's enough. 6 months later, the barn stood rebuilt, larger than before. Community effort turned into solid timber and honest work. The herb garden flourished. Maggie was teaching younger children at the school how to identify healing plants. Ben could track almost as well as Red Sky Walker. Abigail was apprenticing with Doc Pierce, learning medicine that blended Apache knowledge with Western techniques. The ranch thrived. Not wealthy, never wealthy, but stable in the way that mattered more than money. And on a spring morning, when the mountains were still snow-capped and the valley was green with new grass, a rider approached. Apache young, maybe 30, with eyes that carried sorrow and hope in equal measure. He stopped at the property line waiting for permission, respectful of boundaries, the way people who'd had all their boundaries violated learned to be. Ayana emerged from the house, saw him, and her hand went to her mouth. Neshoba. The name came out broken, disbelieving. Little brother. Big sister, he said, dismounting. I've been looking for you for 6 years. They embraced there in the yard, two survivors of a massacre that had tried to erase them, two pieces of a family that refused to stay broken. I thought you were dead, Ayana said, crying and laughing at once. They told me everyone was dead. I was away hunting, Neshoba said. Came back to blood and silence, searched for you everywhere. Finally heard stories about an Apache healer in Lincoln County, married to a white rancher raising 6 children. I thought that sounds impossible enough to be my sister. James appeared on the porch with Joey riding his shoulders, the other 5 children clustering around. Neshoba looked at them, at the mixed family, at the life his sister had built from ruins. You did well, he said in Apache. I survived, Ayana replied in the same language. Then I chose to live. There's a difference. She switched to English, brought Neshoba forward. James, children, this is my brother. He's family. He stays if he wants. Neshoba looked at the ranch, at the mountains beyond, at the life his sister had made with people who should have been enemies but had become something better. I have others looking for home, he said quietly. Other survivors. Other Apache families who left the reservation, who want to live free. Is there room? James and Ayana looked at each other, silent conversation passing between them. There's always room for family, James said. We'll figure it out. And standing there in the morning light, 7 children instead of 6, a family built from choice instead of blood on land that had seen too much violence and was learning how to hold peace, they began again. The becoming never ended. It just kept becoming. Kept growing, kept choosing love over fear, even when fear was easier, even when the world said love between different people was impossible. Sometimes broken pieces made the strongest families, because people who'd been broken knew what it cost to stay whole, and they chose it anyway, every single day. The end.